It started the way it always did, small enough to pretend it didn't matter. A rooftop fundraiser at the top of a glass tower, wind threading between heat lamps, the city spread below like something owned. The invitations were discreet, the donations loud. Politicians smiled for cameras they pretended weren't there. Donors shook hands like they were sealing treaties. Men with criminal money wore philanthropic suits and spoke in gentle tones about community impact, as if kindness could be purchased in bulk and stored in vaults. Eamon Price stood near the catering wall because it was where people didn't look unless they were reaching for something. He kept his shoulders slightly rounded, not slumped. He'd learned the difference. Slumping invited attention. Rounding was safer. His hands stayed close to his body, fingers tucked into his jacket pockets so he wouldn't fidget and give anyone a reason to comment. He had been invited as a last-minute plus one, a donor cancellation patched over with whoever could fill the space. A networking opportunity, the email had called it. Eamon had reread that phrase 3 times like it might change if he stared hard enough. Networking meant be pleasant, don't be weird, don't eat too much, don't take up space. He had dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a button-up that didn't cling too badly, a blazer that made him look more acceptable. He'd combed his hair until his scalp tingled. He'd practiced a smile in the mirror that said, "I'm not a threat. I don't want anything. Please don't notice me too hard." The rooftop air tasted like expensive alcohol and the sharp bite of cold. Eamon waited for a moment when the crowd shifted, when bodies turned toward the stage, when attention loosened its grip. He reached for a drink. Nothing fancy, just sparkling water in a glass that looked like it belonged in someone else's hand. That was when the first snort sounded. It wasn't even loud. That was the cruelty of it. It wasn't meant to start a scene. It was meant to land and leave a bruise. Eamon's fingers paused on the stem of the glass. He pretended he hadn't heard. He had perfected that. Not reacting was an art you learned early if your survival depended on adults staying bored. Someone's voice drifted behind him, too casual, as if sharing a harmless observation. "Careful, that tray might not survive." A few people laughed. Eamon's smile appeared like a reflex. Polite, small, a smile that asked permission to exist. He lifted the glass anyway. His hand didn't tremble, yet. He counted his breaths the way his therapist had once suggested, back when he still believed therapy could fix the fact that the world saw his body before it saw anything else. 1, 2, 3. A second voice, this one louder, more confident, because laughter had already made it safe. "Portion control, buddy. You don't want to embarrass your date." More laughter, sharper now, more people joining in because it always felt good to be on the safe side of a joke. Eamon's stomach tightened. His eyes stayed forward. He didn't have a date. He wasn't anyone's date. He was just a placeholder at a party built for people with sharper teeth than him. He took a sip of sparkling water. The bubbles stung his throat like punishment. Phones came out. At first, Eamon didn't realize. He only noticed the slight shift in the air. People angling their bodies differently, hands lifting, screens glowing. The sound of camera shutters was muted under the music, but Eamon heard it anyway. He always heard the little things. He always felt when attention turned from general to specific. He tried to step back into the shadows, but there wasn't really shadow on a rooftop full of lights. There was only distance, and distance was something people could follow if they decided you were entertainment. "Come on," someone said, voice bright with false kindness. "Don't be shy. Smile for us." Eamon's smile tightened. His cheeks were warm, not from the heaters, from humiliation that rose fast and hot, crawling up his neck like ivy that didn't stop growing. He looked down at his shoes because meeting their eyes made it worse. If he looked up, he might see something in their faces he couldn't unsee. Pity, disgust, amusement, the careful cruelty of people who knew they could do this without consequence. A man he didn't recognize leaned in toward his friend and spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "Why do omegas always look like that when they're trying to blend in, like a kicked dog?" Eamon's chest tightened, omega-coded. They used the phrase like it was biology, like it wasn't a social weapon sharpened over centuries. Eamon had never been officially categorized. No papers, no formal registry. Foster care didn't bother with nuances like that, unless it was to place you somewhere worse. But people had always decided anyway. Soft voice, round face, gentle manner, a body that didn't fit the city's preferred silhouette of dominance. Omega-coded meant safe to mock. Eamon took another breath. He forced himself to hold the glass steady. He refused to flinch. Flinching fed them. He heard his own thoughts, small and desperate. Just make it through. Just don't cry. Crying makes it worse. He had cried once at 13 when a boy shoved his lunch tray into his lap and called him a pig. The foster mother had told him later, not unkindly, "You have to learn not to react, honey. They like it when you react." So Eamon learned. He learned to take pain quietly, to laugh at himself first, to apologize for existing in a body that filled more space than people wanted to make room for. Someone near the center of the group lifted their phone higher and said, "Hold on, get this angle." Eamon's stomach dropped. He felt the moment his forced politeness stopped working, when his smile became something they could point at and mimic. He felt it like a lock clicking, like a room deciding it was allowed to hurt him. He looked toward the exit instinctively, glass doors leading back into the building, but the crowd had thickened, bodies close together, laughter threading between them like wire. No one was physically blocking him, not officially, but the path was crowded in a way that felt intentional. Eamon's fingers tightened around the glass until the stem dug into his skin. He told himself he was fine. He told himself he'd been through worse. Foster homes with doors that locked from the outside. Group homes with staff who treated kindness like a resource you had to earn. Rooms where he learned to sleep light because softness invited theft. This was just words. This was just laughing. But it didn't feel small. It felt like being pinned in place without hands touching you. Another joke landed. Something about how the catering wall must be his natural habitat. Eamon swallowed. His throat burned. He tried to move anyway, taking one careful step to the side, then another, not rushing, because rushing would make them notice more. His brain ran through old survival rules. Don't provoke, don't show fear, don't show anger, don't make them feel guilty. He almost made it, almost slipped into the edge where no one cared. Then Brent Holloway, Eamon would learn the name later, but right now he was only a voice with too much confidence, raised his own glass and spoke like a toast. "Come on," Brent said, smiling wide. "We're all friends here. Let the guy enjoy himself. It's not every day someone like him gets invited up here." Laughter surged. Eamon stopped walking. Someone like him. The phrase was meant to be casual. It hit like a stamp. Eamon's hands went cold. He stared at the city lights beyond the railing, blinking hard because the sting behind his eyes was rising too fast. He could feel his face trying to betray him, trying to fold and crack the way it always did when he was overwhelmed. Not here, not in front of them. He lifted the glass to his lips again, just to have something to do with his hands. That was when the temperature shifted. Not the weather, the room. A subtle change, like the air had been cut by a knife you didn't see. The music didn't stop. The conversation didn't silence all at once. But something moved through the crowd, and it wasn't laughter. Attention turned. Not toward Eamon. Away from him. The circle didn't break, but it loosened, as if bodies instinctively made space for something heavier than cruelty. People glanced toward the entrance with faces that rearranged themselves quickly, smiles smoothing into neutrality, laughter tightening into polite silence. Eamon felt it like a pressure wave. He didn't understand it, not yet, but his skin recognized the sensation of hierarchy snapping into place. He'd seen it in foster homes when a social worker arrived, in group settings when an authority figure walked in, even bullies recalibrated when a stronger predator entered the room. A man stepped onto the rooftop with the calm of someone who never had to hurry. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't announce himself, but the space around him changed anyway. Conversations thinned, shoulders straightened. People who had been laughing a second ago suddenly remembered manners. Eamon's breath caught. He didn't know the man's face, not personally, but he had heard the name enough times to feel it in his bones when the city whispered it. Daxon Vale, the alpha mafia boss, infrastructure king, ports, warehouses, unions, supply lines. Half the city's invisible bloodstream moved because he allowed it. He didn't have to show dominance loudly because the world had already agreed he possessed it. Daxon's gaze swept the rooftop the way a searchlight swept water, slow, thorough, unemotional. It landed on Eamon. Eamon froze. His first instinct was to shrink, to step backward into nothing, to apologize preemptively for being visible when someone like that looked his way. But Daxon didn't look through him. He looked at him. And then, without changing expression, Daxon's gaze shifted to the people holding phones, to the mouths still curved with laughter that hadn't fully died yet, to the man who had been toasting cruelty like it was charm. Eamon felt the space tighten. The laughter didn't stop because they suddenly developed compassion. It stopped because they sensed consequence. And in the sudden hush, with the city wind pressing cold against Eamon's burning face, he understood something too late to undo it. They hadn't been laughing because they were brave. They had been laughing because they thought no one important was watching. Now, someone was. And the night, Eamon could feel it, was no longer theirs to control. Eamon had been small once, not in body, people always assumed that, but in presence. A child who learned to fold himself into corners, to become background, to be the quiet part of a room so no one looked too closely. It wasn't a natural temperament, it was an education. Foster care didn't teach you how to dream, it taught you how to predict, how to read a woman's smile and know if it meant affection or a performance for the caseworker. How to recognize the difference between a door that shut normally and a door that shut with intention. How to eat quickly when food appeared because it might not appear again. And then later, how to eat slowly in public because hunger made people call you names. Softness was always treated like a debt, kindness too. And Eamon was kind in the way some people were without trying, the way his teachers used to praise like a trait that would take him far. He'd believed them for a while. He'd been top of his class in middle school, good memory, fast reading, the sort of mind that caught patterns and held on to them. Then he grew older and learned that being smart didn't matter if no one wanted to hear you. He learned that potential was a word people used when they didn't intend to invest. By 15, he'd been moved enough times that he stopped unpacking his suitcase fully. By 16, he'd learned to laugh at himself first because it was safer than being laughed at. By 17, he understood the invisible ranking system people pretended didn't exist. Sharp edges were admired. Dominance was respected. Bodies that took up space were either trophies or targets. His body made him a target. Food had been a comfort, then a scarcity, then a comfort again. Stress made him hungry. Hunger made him ashamed. Shame made him quiet. Quiet made him survivable. Adults who claimed to care about him often spoke in the same soft, moral tone. Have you tried going for walks? You'd be so handsome if you lost a little. You're such a sweet boy, but you need thicker skin. Thicker skin, as if skin was the problem. As if words didn't cut because people chose to sharpen them. By the time he aged out, Eamon had learned a version of himself that fit into other people's expectations. He kept his voice measured. He apologized, even when he didn't know what he'd done. He made himself useful because usefulness was the closest thing to safety he'd ever been offered. He found work in logistics because it rewarded the way his brain worked. Quiet, systematic, unseen. Boxes went here, paperwork went there, timelines made sense. Routes had rules. And if he did everything right, no one needed to talk about him at all. He liked that. He didn't realize it was also how he'd been disappearing. The nonprofit was legitimate on the surface. Community outreach, warehouse distribution, charity galas, donor reports thick with glossy photos of smiling children. Eamon believed in it the way people believed in lifeboats, not because it was perfect, but because it floated. His job was to keep the lifeboat from cracking. He tracked shipments, scheduled deliveries, verified inventory, smoothed problems before they became emergencies. People liked him because he was competent and unthreatening, the sort of worker you didn't have to manage. He didn't attend office parties, he didn't flirt with anyone. He kept his head down and paid his rent and pretended he didn't hear the whispers that sometimes followed him down a hallway. Chubby, Omega-coded. Too soft. He had no paperwork that said Omega, no official designation, but the city didn't need documents to decide what you were. Omega-coded was a label they stuck on anyone they wanted to treat as lesser. It wasn't about biology, it was about permission. Permission to talk down, permission to touch without asking, permission to laugh. Eamon learned to avoid mirrors because mirrors made the permission feel visible. He learned to wear darker colors, loose fits, jackets that made his shoulders look broader and his stomach less noticeable. He learned to smile in ways that reassured people he wasn't going to demand better treatment. It worked, mostly, until the invitation. It arrived on a Tuesday, An email forwarded with a bright subject line that used his first name like a gift. Eamon, quick favor. Can you cover a donor plus one slot tonight? It's important. Great networking opportunity. Dress code? Cocktail. Rooftop venue. Let me know ASAP. He stared at the screen for a long time. A plus one slot, as if he was a spare piece. He should have said no. He wanted to say no. But rent was due, and his medical debt sat in his phone's reminder app like a countdown. A new tooth filling he couldn't postpone any longer. A doctor appointment he'd been skipping for months because maybe it'll go away was cheaper than facing another bill. Networking could mean a better position, better pay, a way out of always counting pennies like prayers. He told himself this wasn't about vanity. He told himself it was survival. So he replied, yes. He spent the rest of the afternoon fighting with his closet, not because he didn't have clothes, but because he didn't have permission in his own mind to dress like he belonged anywhere expensive. Every button-up felt wrong. Every suit jacket made him look like a kid playing grown-up. He finally chose the least offensive combination and stood in front of the mirror, forcing himself not to flinch at his own reflection. Chubby cheeks, soft jawline, a belly that curved under the fabric no matter what angle he stood at. He adjusted his collar and practiced his smile, polite, small, safe. When he arrived at the rooftop, the first 10 minutes were deceptively calm. He blended. He stood near the edges. He nodded when spoken to. He laughed softly at jokes that weren't funny because the sound of laughter made people think you were friendly, and friendly meant harmless. He took a glass of sparkling water because alcohol made his cheeks flush, and flush made people comment. He watched the room like he always did, tracking tension, watching hands, reading micro-expressions the way some people read menus. He could tell who wanted something, who was bored, who was pretending to care about charity so their sins looked more palatable. He noticed the way certain donors didn't wear name tags, the way security stood a little too close to certain men and a little too far from others, the way people with real power rarely raised their voices. Eamon didn't know what half the undercurrents meant, but he felt them. Then, slowly, the room began to decide he was entertainment. It happened the way predators tested fences. A remark made softly, a laugh that invited others, a glance toward Eamon's body like it was a public object, the kind of mockery that always claimed it was just a joke when someone looked hurt. Eamon tried to outlast it. He told himself it would pass, that he could endure. Endurance was his strongest muscle. But the jokes sharpened. Phones lifted, the circle tightened. Eamon's mouth formed the polite smile without permission from his heart, the way his body had learned to protect him even when he hated it. He could have left. He thought about it. He even watched the glass doors, calculating the cleanest path. But leaving meant admitting it hurt. Leaving meant letting them win. Leaving meant giving them a story to tell about how the chubby Omega ran away. So Eamon did what he always did. He stayed. He let the laughter land and forced himself not to react because he had been taught that reacting was the worst kind of crime. And then, just when the humiliation began to feel inevitable, like weather, you couldn't stop it. You could only endure it. The air changed. The rooftop didn't get colder, but Eamon felt the crowd's attention shift the way animals sensed a new predator. The laughter thinned. Voices softened. Smiles rearranged themselves into something safer. Eamon turned his head, and for a moment he forgot to keep his face composed. Because the man who stepped onto the rooftop didn't look like the people Eamon was used to, not the loud donors, not the harmless officials, not the smiling social climbers. This man moved like consequence. The name he'd heard in whispers floated up uninvited, heavy as a stone in his stomach. Daxon Vale. Eamon didn't know why the name mattered to him personally. He didn't even know what Daxon Vale looked like until that second. But his body knew. Some part of Eamon, some survival instinct older than shame, recognized the shift and understood with a sudden terrifying clarity. This wasn't about him anymore. Not because he had been rescued, because the room had just been reminded that cruelty had witnesses, and in this city, witnesses with power didn't forget. Daxon Vale did not interrupt the laughter. That was the first mistake everyone made. They expected outrage, a sharp word, a visible reaction they could pivot around, apologize for, soften with flattery. Powerful men were predictable that way. Anger first, consequence later, if at all. Daxon offered none of it. He stood just inside the perimeter of the rooftop, hands relaxed at his sides, posture loose in a way that only came from knowing nothing in the room could touch him unless he allowed it. His suit was dark, unremarkable in cut, expensive in the way that didn't announce itself. No jewelry, no visible indulgence, control worn like a second skin. His gaze moved slowly, not scanning, cataloging. Eamon felt it when that attention brushed past him. It wasn't invasive, it wasn't hungry, it was the sensation of being noted, the way a variable was noted in a system that ran on cause and effect. The laughter thinned further. Phones dipped, then lowered entirely as people noticed the shift in tone. Smiles froze in half curves that no longer knew what they were supposed to be. Someone cleared their throat too loudly and then looked embarrassed by the sound. Eamon's pulse thudded in his ears. He didn't know what Daxon Vale thought when he saw him standing near the catering wall with a glass clutched too tightly in his hand. He didn't know what calculations ran behind that calm expression. He only knew that for the first time since the jokes began, the room was no longer feeding on him. Daxon's attention drifted from Eamon to the people around him, to the ones who had laughed the loudest, to the ones who had lifted their phones like weapons disguised as souvenirs. His gaze paused on Brent Holloway. Brent noticed. That was the second mistake. Brent straightened, the instinctive confidence of a man who had survived by sensing when to perform. He lifted his glass slightly, smile already in place, the kind that assumed forgiveness because it had never been denied before. "Evening," Brent said, tone light, friendly. "Didn't see you come in." Daxon didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, deliberate. People shifted. A woman near the railing glanced at the exit. Someone else checked their phone without unlocking it, a reflex that betrayed nerves. Eamon stood very still. He felt like a fault line had been exposed beneath his feet. Daxon's eyes finally met Brent's. "You were laughing," Daxon said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation." Brent chuckled, relief flashing across his face like he'd been thrown a rope. "Oh, yeah, just a joke. You know how it is. Fundraisers get a little loose." A few people laughed reflexively, then stopped when the sound echoed too sharply in the quiet. Eamon's fingers ached around the glass. He hated that his first instinct was still to apologize. To step forward and say it was fine, really, he didn't mind, so no one had to be uncomfortable. He hated that years of conditioning didn't vanish just because someone powerful had noticed. Daxon tilted his head slightly, considering Brent the way a mathematician considered a flawed equation. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." The word landed heavy. Brent's smile faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. "It's nothing serious, just harmless teasing. We were all having a laugh." Daxon's gaze flicked briefly, not to Eamon's body, not to his clothes, but to his face, to the tightness around his mouth, to the careful stillness that read as endurance if you knew what you were looking at. Then Daxon looked back at Brent. "That wasn't laughter," he said. "That was a test." The rooftop seemed to inhale as one. Brent blinked. "A test?" "To see who you could hurt without consequence," Daxon continued. His voice never rose, never sharpened. "To see who would join you, to see who would record it." Phones vanished entirely now. Someone near the bar swallowed audibly. Brent laughed again, too loud this time. "You're reading way too much into it." Daxon didn't argue. He took a step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't fast, but the space rearranged itself around him anyway. People leaned back, someone bumped into a table and whispered an apology that wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. Eamon's breath caught. He had never seen power move like this. Quiet, precise, uninterested in permission. Daxon stopped where the semicircle of onlookers ended and the space around Eamon began. Close enough now that Eamon could see the fine lines near his eyes, the faint scar near his jaw that suggested violence not spoken about. "You think it's harmless," Daxon said, eyes still on Brent, "because you assume the world agrees with you." Brent's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean anything by it." Daxon's gaze sharpened, just a fraction. "Intent doesn't erase outcome." That sentence sent a ripple through the crowd. It was the kind of line people remembered later, the kind they repeated in different rooms with lower ceilings and higher stakes. Eamon's chest felt too tight. He realized, distantly, that he was shaking. Daxon noticed. He turned fully toward Eamon then, attention settling with a weight that made the room disappear. Up close, his presence wasn't overwhelming. It was focused, like standing in the path of something that had already decided where it was going. "You're shaking," Daxon said. Not loud, not soft, just factual. Eamon nodded before he could stop himself, heat flooding his face. Shame followed close behind, instinctive and cruel. "I'm sorry." The apology slipped out automatically. Daxon's brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" he asked. The question landed like a crack in a wall Eamon hadn't realized he was leaning on. Eamon's mouth opened, then closed. For existing, for being seen, for being an inconvenience. None of the answers sounded acceptable. "I just," Eamon swallowed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered, "Jesus," under their breath. Daxon turned his head slowly, gaze sweeping the faces around them. "He didn't cause trouble," he said. The words carried. "He was targeted." The rooftop went very still. Brent scoffed weakly. "Targeted? Come on, that's dramatic." Daxon looked back at him, and for the first time, something like amusement touched his expression. Not warmth, not humor, recognition. "You're still talking," Daxon said. "That tells me you don't understand what just happened." Brent's smile finally broke. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. Daxon didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he did something no one expected. He stepped fully into Eamon's space, not crowding, not looming, just close enough that the crowd collectively held its breath. Eamon's heart slammed against his ribs. His instincts screamed danger, not because Daxon felt unsafe, but because being the focus of someone like that felt like standing under a spotlight with no script. Daxon raised his hand. Slowly. Open palm. No clenched fist. No threat. And rested it on Eamon's shoulder. The contact was unmistakable, possessive, not in ownership, but in declaration. The world froze. Eamon's breath left him in a shaky rush. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. The touch wasn't heavy, but it anchored him, steady and deliberate, like a line drawn in ink you couldn't pretend not to see. Daxon turned back to the crowd, his hands still there. "You're laughing," he said, voice carrying easily now, "because you think worth is visible." Silence. That power looks one way. That softness means weakness. No one spoke. No one moved. Daxon's thumb pressed lightly once against Eamon's shoulder, grounding him whether Eamon wanted it or not. "You're wrong," Daxon said. Then he said the words that would fracture reputations, alliances, and the illusion of safety cruelty had been hiding behind. "I claim him." The rooftop erupted into a silence so absolute it rang. Glasses lowered, faces drained of color. Someone dropped their phone, it clattered against the concrete like a gunshot, and no one laughed. Claiming, in their world, wasn't metaphor. It meant protection backed by consequence. It meant every word spoken against Eamon had just been logged by a man who never forgot debts. Brent's mouth opened. No sound came out. Daxon looked at him and smiled for the first time that night. And Eamon, heart pounding, shoulder warm under a hand that had just rewritten the rules of his existence, understood with dizzying clarity. The laughter hadn't just stopped, it had become evidence. The silence didn't break. It thickened. Eamon felt it press against his ears, his chest, his thoughts, an absence so complete it became a presence of its own, the kind of quiet that followed disaster, when everyone was waiting to see who would move first and what the cost would be. Daxon's hand remained on his shoulder. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't restraining, but it was there, unmistakable and public, a line drawn so clearly that no one could pretend it hadn't been crossed. Eamon's body reacted before his mind could catch up, muscles locking, breath shallow, heart hammering like it wanted out. He had never been touched like this in public, not with intent, not with meaning that carried weight beyond the moment. Claimed. The word echoed in his head, strange and terrifying. Claiming wasn't romance. It wasn't affection. It was a declaration woven deep into the city's hierarchy, into criminal etiquette and unspoken law. It meant protection, yes, but it also meant attention, scrutiny, being bound to someone whose shadow swallowed rooms. Eamon swallowed hard. Daxon removed his hand at last, the absence of contact almost disorienting. The warmth lingered like an imprint, his shoulder tingling where fingers had rested. The crowd didn't surge back into motion. No one laughed it off. No one congratulated anyone. The usual social reflexes failed in the face of something too real, too consequential. Brent Holloway recovered first. That, too, was a mistake. "You can't be serious," Brent said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to his own ears. This is this is a bit dramatic, don't you think? He's just Daxon turned his head slowly. Brent stopped talking mid-sentence, the words dying like they'd been cut off at the source. Daxon didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Brent the way you looked at something that had already made its last error. "You recorded him," Daxon said. Brent blinked. What?" "Your phone," Daxon continued calmly. "You lifted it when you thought it was safe." Brent's hand tightened reflexively around the device still at his side. Daxon's gaze flicked to it, then back to Brent's face. "Delete it." Brent hesitated. Eamon felt that hesitation like a pulled wire. The crowd did too. A dozen people watched Brent's thumb hover, caught between ego and survival. "It was just for fun," Brent said, trying again. "I didn't post it anywhere." "That's irrelevant," Daxon replied. The pause stretched. Then Brent laughed again. Too sharp, too loud. "You don't get to tell me what to do with my phone." The air went thin. Eamon's stomach dropped. He wanted to step back, to disappear, to undo whatever had just been set in motion. He didn't want this kind of attention. He didn't want someone to be punished because of him. Daxon exhaled once, slow and controlled. "You're right," he said. "I don't." He turned away from Brent and addressed the room instead. "Anyone else recording?" No one moved. Phones stayed down. Hands stilled. Even the bravest donors avoided his gaze. Daxon nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. He looked back at Brent. "You're free to keep it." Brent's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. Daxon's voice remained level. "And I'm free to remember." Brent went pale. The exchange didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a verdict. Eamon's legs felt weak. He shifted his weight slightly, and Daxon noticed immediately. "Do you need to sit?" Daxon asked him quietly. The question startled Eamon more than anything else that night. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Can you handle this?" Just, "Do you need something?" I, "I'm fine," Eamon said automatically. Daxon studied him for a moment. Then, without comment, he gestured toward a nearby chair that someone had already moved forward without being asked. Eamon hesitated. A dozen eyes followed him. He sat. The chair felt too solid beneath him, grounding him in a way that made the reality of the moment harder to escape. His hands rested in his lap, fingers twisting together despite his efforts to keep them still. Daxon remained standing beside him, an unspoken barrier between Eamon and the rest of the room. "You're all here to raise money," Daxon said to the crowd, "to signal virtue, to remind each other that you're good people." No one interrupted. "Tonight," he continued, "you were given a chance to prove it." His gaze swept the rooftop again, landing briefly on faces that had laughed, faces that had watched without intervening, faces that had looked away and pretended not to see. "You failed." The word landed with finality. Eamon closed his eyes for half a second, overwhelmed. This wasn't how justice usually looked in his life. There was no lecture, no forced apology, no empty promise to do better. There was just consequence, stated plainly. Daxon turned slightly toward Eamon again, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "I didn't ask you first," he said. Eamon's eyes snapped open. "I should have," Daxon continued. "For that, I apologize." The apology hit harder than the claim. "I didn't," Eamon's voice faltered. He cleared his throat. "I don't understand what happens now." Daxon nodded once, as if he'd expected that. "Right now you leave." Eamon stiffened. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Daxon said, "but you've had enough of tonight." The words weren't dismissive. They were protective, and that scared Eamon more than anger would have. "And them?" Eamon asked quietly, glancing toward the frozen crowd. Daxon's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile. Not quite. "They'll remember this moment for a long time." As if on cue, the crowd began to stir, not back into laughter, but into careful motion. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. People avoided Eamon's gaze now, not out of mockery, but fear of association. Brent stood rigid, jaw clenched, phone still in his hand, like it weighed 100 pounds. Daxon didn't look at him again. He offered Eamon his arm, not as a command, not as a pull, an option. Eamon stared at it. He thought of every time he'd been told to be grateful for scraps of kindness. Every time someone's help came with strings he didn't see until they tightened. His instincts screamed danger. But the rooftop, the laughter, the phones, that was danger too. Slowly, Eamon took Daxon's arm. The contact was brief, steady. Daxon adjusted his pace immediately, matching Eamon's without comment as they moved toward the exit. No one stopped them. The glass doors opened. Cool air rushed in, carrying the muted sounds of the building below. As they stepped inside, the rooftop fell away behind them like a stage after the curtain dropped. Eamon's legs finally gave a little once they were out of sight. He caught himself against the wall, breath coming fast and shallow. Daxon turned fully toward him then, expression unreadable. "You don't owe me," Daxon said quietly, as if answering a question Eamon hadn't yet asked. "Not for that." Eamon laughed weakly. "It doesn't feel like that." Daxon's gaze held his. "That's because the world taught you kindness is transactional." Eamon looked down at his hands, still trembling. "Isn't it?" Daxon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said, "Let's get you home." And as they walked toward the elevator, away from laughter turned to silence, away from a room that had finally been forced to see, Eamon realized the claim hadn't ended the night. It had only moved the consequences somewhere quieter, somewhere far more dangerous. The fallout did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with emails that went unanswered, calls that rang once and stopped, contracts that stalled mid-signature and never resumed. It arrived as calendar invitations quietly revoked and temporary delays that became permanent. It arrived as doors that had once opened with a smile now closed with polite regret. Brent Holloway woke the next morning to a silence that felt wrong. His assistant didn't reply. His bank app lagged, then refused to load. A meeting he'd scheduled weeks ago vanished from his calendar without explanation. By noon, 3 sponsors had requested restructuring discussions. By evening, an audit notice appeared in his inbox, flagged urgent, its sender an agency that didn't make mistakes. No one mentioned the rooftop. They didn't have to. Daxon Vale didn't touch Brent with his hands. He touched him with systems. Ports suddenly became unavailable. A warehouse contract failed compliance. An old partner remembered a clause they'd both forgotten. Investigations surfaced not because Daxon invented them, but because he stopped protecting the people who had buried them. It was erasure by subtraction, and everyone who mattered understood exactly why it was happening. Eamon watched it unfold from the back seat of Daxon's car, city lights streaking past the tinted windows like something unreal. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, knuckles pale, breath shallow. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean and understated. He hadn't spoken since they left the building. The elevator ride down had been silent, the kind that stretched every second thin. Daxon had stood close without crowding, angled slightly toward Eamon like a shield that didn't announce itself. No one had looked at Eamon directly when the doors opened. A few people had looked at Daxon. Fewer still had held his gaze. The car door closed with a soft, final sound. Only then did Eamon feel his composure crack. "I didn't ask for that," he said suddenly, voice tight. Daxon didn't turn his head. "I know." The simplicity of the response made Eamon's chest ache. "They're going to think I planned it," Eamon continued, words tumbling out now that they'd started. "That I wanted him punished, that I used you." Daxon's gaze remained on the road ahead. "People who think like that were never going to treat you fairly." "That doesn't make it easier," Eamon said. "No," Daxon agreed. "It doesn't." Silence returned, heavier now. Eamon stared at his reflection in the glass, barely visible over the city's blur. He looked the same as he had an hour ago. Same body, same face, same quiet presence. And yet, everything had changed. "Why him?" Eamon asked finally. Why do all that over me? Daxon exhaled slowly. Because cruelty survives when it's cheap. Eamon frowned. I don't understand. Humiliation, Daxon said, choosing his words carefully, is a currency people like Holloway trade in. It costs them nothing and makes them feel powerful. The moment it becomes expensive, they stop spending it. Eamon swallowed. So, you're making an example. Daxon turned his head then, meeting Eamon's eyes for the first time since they'd left the rooftop. I'm correcting a balance, he said. Eamon's throat tightened. By claiming me. Yes. The word landed heavy between them. Eamon looked away. That's what scares me. Daxon studied him quietly. Tell me. Eamon's fingers twisted together. Claiming isn't neutral. It means something. It means I'm attached to you now, whether I want to be or not. People will assume I owe you. Daxon nodded once. They will. And do I? Eamon asked. The car slowed at a red light, city noise bleeding faintly through the glass. Daxon didn't answer right away. That's what everyone assumes, he said at last. That claiming is ownership. Eamon's chest tightened. That it's a debt, Daxon continued. A leash. He turned fully toward Eamon now, expression steady, voice low. It isn't. Eamon searched his face for irony, for manipulation, for the hidden cost that always followed words like that. I claimed you publicly, Daxon said. That means every action taken in your name reflects on me. Every harm done to you becomes my failure. Every insult is no longer yours to endure alone. Eamon's breath caught. That's worse. Daxon's mouth curved slightly. For me? Yes. Eamon blinked. You're saying you're accountable? Yes. Not you belong to me. Not you owe me. Just, I am responsible. Eamon's mind struggled to catch up. Then what do you expect from me? Daxon shook his head. Nothing. The word felt too big to trust. I don't believe that, Eamon said quietly. Daxon didn't bristle. That's reasonable. The light turned green. The car moved again. Eamon stared down at his hands. You could have ignored it, he said. People do? All the time. Daxon's voice was calm. I could have. So why didn't you? Another pause. Because I was watching, Daxon said, and because silence would have made me complicit. Eamon closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a grief he didn't know how to name. Not grief for Brent, not even for himself. Grief for all the moments like this that had been ignored. When the car finally stopped, Eamon startled. They weren't at his apartment. He stiffened. This isn't... I know, Daxon said. You don't go back there tonight. Panic flared. You said I didn't owe you. You don't, Daxon replied. But you were recorded. Your address is a liability now. Eamon's stomach dropped. So I have to hide. Daxon's gaze sharpened. No, you have to be protected. The distinction didn't soothe him. They exited the car into a quiet building with understated security. No logos, no obvious guards, just controlled access and the hum of systems designed to notice what others missed. Inside, Daxon led him to a private sitting room, clean lines, soft lighting, nothing ostentatious. You'll stay here tonight, Daxon said. Tomorrow, you decide what happens next. Eamon hesitated in the doorway. And if I decide I don't want this? Daxon met his gaze without flinching. Then the claim ends. The words hit like a shock. You can undo it? Eamon asked. I can make it clear it was situational, Daxon said. That it doesn't bind you. Eamon's heart pounded. And the people who laughed? Daxon's expression cooled. They'll still remember. Eamon nodded slowly, absorbing that. He stepped into the room and turned back to Daxon. Thank you, he said, then winced, hating how small it sounded. Daxon didn't correct him. Instead, he said, Get some rest. Tomorrow we talk terms. As the door closed behind him, Eamon sank onto the couch, exhaustion crashing over him in waves. For the first time, cruelty had been answered with consequence instead of endurance. And for the first time in his life, Eamon realized something even more terrifying than being mocked. Being seen meant the world could no longer pretend he didn't matter. And that, far more than laughter, came with a cost. Eamon woke expecting dread. It was what usually came after nights like that, after humiliation, after disruption, after attention he hadn't asked for. Dread lived in his muscles, in the shallow ache behind his eyes, in the instinctive inventory of what could go wrong next. But when his eyes opened, the room was quiet in a way that didn't feel like waiting. Soft morning light filtered through sheer curtains. The couch he'd fallen asleep on was wider than his bed at home, the blanket tucked over him heavy and warm. For a few seconds, he didn't move, afraid that motion would shatter whatever fragile calm had settled over him. Nothing happened. No alarms, no voices, no sudden demand for gratitude or compliance. Just stillness. Eamon sat up slowly, heart beating a little faster as his body remembered where he was. The sitting room looked the same as it had the night before, clean, spare, impersonal in a way that felt intentional. There were no cameras in obvious places, no reminders of ownership, no symbols of dominance carved into the space. A choice, not a cage. The thought surprised him. He stood, smoothing his wrinkled clothes with hands that still trembled slightly, and made his way toward the door. It opened easily. The hallway beyond was quiet. A woman passed him with a nod, professional, neutral, not curious. No one stared. No one smiled like he was a novelty. He followed the scent of coffee to a small kitchen where Daxon stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, pouring hot water into a mug. The sight stopped Eamon in his tracks. Not because it was domestic, not because it was intimate, because it was ordinary. Daxon noticed him immediately, gaze lifting without surprise. "You're awake." "Yes," Eamon said, then hesitated. "I didn't know where—" "You don't need permission to be here," Daxon said, setting the mug down and turning fully toward him. "Coffee?" Eamon blinked. "You're asking?" Daxon's mouth curved faintly. "I'm not in the habit of forcing caffeine." Eamon let out a quiet, disbelieving huff of laughter. Then, "Yes, please." Daxon poured another mug and slid it across the counter, stopping well short of Eamon's space. No looming, no expectation that Eamon would move faster than he was ready to. Eamon wrapped his hands around the mug and let the warmth sink into his fingers. "You said we'd talk today." "Yes." Eamon waited for the but, the condition, the quiet hook beneath the kindness. It didn't come. Daxon leaned back against the counter instead. "I won't try to change you." The words were direct, unembellished. Eamon frowned slightly. "Most people say that and mean something else." "I know," Daxon replied. "I mean it literally." Eamon studied him, searching for the angle. No diet plans, no image consultants, no telling me how to dress or speak. "No," Daxon said. "No hiding me away," Eamon pressed. "No pretending I don't exist unless it's convenient." Daxon's gaze sharpened, not with irritation, but conviction. "You will not be hidden." Eamon's chest tightened. "Then what is this?" Daxon considered him carefully. "Protection." "And what does that cost?" Eamon asked. "Time," Daxon said. "Resources, attention." Eamon's jaw clenched. "Those are costs you choose. I mean for me." Daxon didn't deflect. "People will associate you with me. They already do." "Yes," Daxon agreed. "And you can walk away from that if you decide it's too much." The simplicity of it made Eamon's throat ache. "I don't have to earn it?" Eamon asked quietly. "No." Eamon looked down into his coffee, watching the faint ripples fade. "That's new." Daxon nodded. "It shouldn't be. Shouldn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't rush to be filled. "I'm not asking you to stay," Daxon said finally. "I'm offering you the option." Eamon lifted his gaze. "And if I stay?" "Then you stay as you are," Daxon replied. "Not improved, not corrected, not made palatable for other people." Eamon swallowed. "And if someone treats me like they did last night?" Daxon's eyes went cold. Not angry, but absolute. "Then they answer to me." Eamon shivered, not in fear, but in something dangerously close to relief. He had spent his life believing protection required compromise. That safety meant shrinking, softening, apologizing preemptively for being in the way. This was different. You're not afraid I'll embarrass you? Eamon asked. Daxon's mouth twitched. No. You don't think I make you look weak? Daxon met his gaze steadily. Anyone who thinks that was never worth impressing. Eamon's breath hitched. No one had ever said that to him without a joke attached. I need time, Eamon said. Daxon nodded. You have it. No pressure, Eamon added, almost testing. No pressure, Daxon echoed. Eamon finished his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth and the unfamiliar sensation of being offered something without strings. When he set the mug down, his hands were steadier than they had been in weeks. He didn't know yet whether he would stay, but for the first time, staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like space, and in that space, something fragile began to grow. Not dependence, not obligation, but the quiet understanding that protection did not require him to disappear. Not anymore. It took Eamon a long time to understand that what he'd been taught to hate about himself was not the same thing as what had hurt him. For years, he'd believed the lie because it was efficient, because it explained everything in a way that felt almost mercifully simple. He was mocked because he was soft, ignored because he was chubby, passed over because he didn't look like power. If he changed those things, if he became sharper, smaller, harder, then the pain would stop. That lie had shaped his entire posture in the world. But standing in Daxon's office weeks later, watching the city move below massive windows, Eamon felt something shift into place that no amount of reassurance could have forced. He hadn't changed. Not really. His body was the same. His voice was still gentle. His instinct, when faced with tension, was still to smooth it over rather than dominate it. And yet, the cruelty had stopped. Not because he had transformed, because the context had. Because the world had finally been forced to reckon with the fact that it was the one behaving badly, not him. You're quiet, Daxon observed. Eamon glanced up from the documents he'd been reviewing, startled. I usually am. Daxon's mouth curved slightly. You're quieter than usual. Eamon considered that. He set the folder down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk without thinking. Old habits didn't disappear just because new truths arrived. I was thinking, Eamon said. That's rarely dangerous, Daxon replied. Eamon huffed softly. I used to think endurance was the same as weakness. Daxon leaned back in his chair, listening. I thought I survived because I bent, Eamon continued. Because I stayed small, because I didn't fight back. Daxon didn't interrupt. He never did when Eamon spoke like this, when the words came slow and careful, excavated rather than spilled. But that's not true, Eamon said quietly. I survived because I lasted. Daxon's gaze sharpened, not predatory, not dominant, interested. I didn't win arguments, Eamon said. I outlived them. I didn't overpower people. I waited until their cruelty got bored and moved on. He swallowed. That's not weakness. It's stamina. Daxon nodded once. Most people confuse loudness for strength. Eamon smiled faintly. I know. The realization settled deeper than he expected, like a bone finally aligning after years slightly out of place. It hurt, but it hurt in the way healing did. He thought back to the rooftop, to the laughter, to how easily they'd assumed his silence meant consent, how they'd mistaken endurance for permission. They had needed numbers, phones, voices, a crowd. Eamon had needed only himself. You never asked me to change, Eamon said suddenly. Daxon met his gaze. No. You never even suggested it. Daxon shrugged slightly. Why would I? Eamon laughed, a quiet sound edged with disbelief. Most people would have. Most people, Daxon said calmly, measure worth by resemblance. Eamon tilted his head. To themselves? To their idea of power, Daxon corrected. You don't resemble that idea, you challenge it. The word sent a shiver through Eamon. Not fear, not pride, recognition. I don't want to be a symbol, Eamon said. Daxon's response was immediate. You're not. I don't want people looking at me like I represent something. They're going to, Daxon said. But not because you asked them to. Eamon sighed. I just want to exist. Daxon's gaze softened, something almost human slipping through the iron control. That's the most dangerous desire there is. Eamon blinked. Dangerous? To systems built on hierarchy, Daxon replied. Existence without apology undermines them. Eamon absorbed that in silence. Later, alone, Eamon stood in front of his mirror, not to critique, not to bargain with his reflection, just to look. He saw the same soft face, the same body that had been the punchline of so many jokes, the same shape that had taught him to be careful, to be patient, to endure. But now, layered over it, was something else. Context, history, survival. He wasn't fragile because he was soft. He was soft because he'd survived things that would have hardened someone else beyond recognition. That night, Eamon slept deeply, without rehearsing conversations that might hurt him tomorrow. For the first time, his body didn't feel like evidence, it felt like proof. And when he woke, the thought that greeted him was simple and steady. He had never been weak. He had only been surrounded by people who mistook cruelty for strength. Not anymore. Months later, people still talked about the rooftop. They never said Eamon's name first. They spoke about the silence, about how a room full of donors and power brokers had learned, in a single breathless moment, that laughter could turn dangerous if it revealed too much about the person holding it. About how mockery, once cheap, once recreational, had suddenly acquired weight, risk. People remembered where they had been standing, what they had been holding, who had laughed, and who had stopped themselves just in time. Stories grew cleaner with retelling, less about the cruelty itself and more about the shift, the way the air had changed when Daxon Vale stepped forward and refused to let the moment pass. In private rooms, people said things like, "You don't joke like that anymore." In quieter voices, they added, "Not since that night." Brent Holloway disappeared from polite conversation entirely. No one asked where he'd gone. No one wondered out loud what had happened. Absence in that world was explanation enough. Invitations dried up. His name became something people stumbled over and then smoothed past, like a stain you didn't acknowledge because acknowledging it meant remembering why it was there. Eamon heard about it the way he heard about most things now, indirectly, without being the subject of the sentence. That was deliberate. Daxon never spoke for him, never framed Eamon as a cause or a lesson. When people asked questions, Daxon answered only what was necessary. When they pressed, he redirected. When they speculated, he let the speculation collapse under its own weight. Eamon was not paraded. He was not hidden. He simply existed. And that, it turned out, unsettled people more than any spectacle could have. At events, Eamon noticed how conversations adjusted around him, not in fear, not in reverence, but in recalibration. Jokes stopped short. Comments were reconsidered. People thought before speaking in ways they never had before because they now knew someone was listening who did not confuse silence with approval. Eamon didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. One evening, long after the rooftop had faded into story, Eamon stood on another terrace, not a fundraiser this time, just a quiet building with a view of the river. The city lights reflected off the water in long, broken lines. Daxon stood beside him, hands resting on the railing, posture relaxed in a way that meant nothing urgent demanded his attention. "They still talk about it," Eamon said. Daxon nodded. "They will for a long time." Eamon tilted his head. "About you claiming me." Daxon glanced at him. "About what it cost them." Eamon considered that. "You know," Eamon said slowly, "I used to think being chosen meant someone else decided you were worth protecting." Daxon waited. "I don't think that anymore," Eamon continued. "I think it just means the world finally got corrected." Daxon's mouth curved faintly. "Accurate." Eamon rested his elbows on the railing, feeling solid, grounded in his own body. They laughed because they thought no one important was watching. Daxon's gaze stayed on the city. They were wrong. Eamon smiled. Not small, not practiced, just real. He thought of the boy he'd been, the foster kid who learned to eat quietly, the teenager who learned to disappear, the man who stood by a catering wall and let laughter pass through him because he believed it had to. That boy hadn't been weak. He had been enduring a world that mistook cruelty for entertainment and softness for permission. Now, that world had been forced to look at itself, and it had blinked first. Eamon straightened, shoulders back. Not performative, not defiant, just present. You didn't make me worthy, Eamon said. Daxon turned toward him fully. No, you didn't save me. No, Daxon agreed. You were already standing. Eamon exhaled, something light and relieved leaving his chest. You just made sure they couldn't push me anymore. Daxon inclined his head. That was the responsibility I took. They stood there in silence, not the suffocating kind Eamon had learned to fear, but the kind that came from shared understanding. Below them, the city moved on. Deals were made. Hierarchies shifted. New cruelty tried to take root and found the ground less welcoming than it used to be. Because somewhere in the collective memory of power, a lesson had lodged itself deep and sharp. Laughter was not harmless. Not when it was aimed downward. Not when it fed on silence. Not when someone was watching who understood the cost. And Eamon, no longer hidden, no longer shrinking, carried that truth with him, not as a burden, but as a quiet certainty. You don't become worthy when someone claims you. You realize you always were. The moment the world is forced to see it.